Before we begin this incredible journey, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story touches your heart, please like and subscribe. Have a beautiful day and enjoy the story. Victoria Hayes stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite, her trembling fingers adjusting the delicate lace veil that cascaded down her shoulders. The ivory gown she wore was her own creation, every stitch a labor of love, every pearl hand-sewn during late nights in her small design studio. At 27, she had built a modest but respected name in the wedding dress industry, and today was supposed to be her crowning moment. Wearing her own masterpiece down the aisle, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the countryside chapel, casting golden patterns across the vintage wooden floors. Outside, 150 guests filled the pews, their cheerful chatter drifting through the old stone walls. Everything looked perfect. Everything except the growing knot of anxiety in Victoria's stomach. "He'll be here," her sister Rachel said, squeezing her hand. Rachel's confident smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Brandon wouldn't do this to you." But Victoria knew something was wrong. She had felt it for weeks now, the distance growing between them like an invisible wall. Brandon Mitchell, the charming photographer she had fallen for 2 years ago, had been pulling away. His kisses had become mechanical. His eyes wandered during conversations. The passion that once burned bright between them had dimmed to barely glowing embers. "It's already 20 minutes past," Victoria whispered, her dark brown eyes fixed on her phone screen. No messages, no calls. Just silence that screamed louder than any words could. The door to the bridal suite opened without warning, and both women turned, hoping to see Brandon's apologetic face. Instead, a tall figure filled the doorway, commanding immediate attention. Julian Thornfield stepped inside, his presence transforming the atmosphere of the room entirely. Victoria had met Julian several times over the past year. He was Brandon's mentor in the photography world, a successful art dealer who owned 3 galleries across the country. At 34, Julian Thornfield had built an empire through his eye for talent and beauty. He was known for his sharp business sense, his substantial wealth, and his intensely private nature. Standing well over 6 feet tall with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, he possessed the kind of timeless elegance that turned heads wherever he went. "Julian," Victoria breathed, her heart sinking. His presence here, instead of Brandon's, could only mean one thing. "Victoria, Rachel." He acknowledged them both with a slight nod, his steel-gray eyes settling on Victoria's face with an expression that seemed almost pained. "I need to speak with Victoria alone." Rachel hesitated, her protective instincts flaring, but Victoria nodded. "It's all right. Please give us a moment." When the door closed behind Rachel, silence filled the space between them. Julian remained near the doorway, as if maintaining that distance required conscious effort. "He's not coming, is he?" Victoria asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded despite the world crumbling around her. "No," Julian replied quietly. "Brandon left town this morning. He asked me to deliver his message." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. She sank onto the cushioned bench near the window, her carefully styled hair and perfect makeup suddenly feeling like an elaborate costume for a play that had been canceled. "What message?" she managed to ask. Julian moved closer but maintained a respectful distance. His jaw tightened as he spoke. He said he wasn't ready, that he felt trapped, that he needed to find himself before committing to anyone. A bitter laugh escaped Victoria's lips. "Find himself? We've been planning this wedding for 8 months. He proposed to me, Julian. He chose this." "I know." Something flickered in Julian's expression, a flash of anger that seemed directed at Brandon rather than at her. "For what it's worth, I think he's made the biggest mistake of his life." Victoria looked up at him, studying his face. They had never been close, despite the time Brandon spent working with Julian. But she had always sensed something in the way Julian looked at her during the few occasions they met. A quiet intensity, an attention that felt deeper than mere politeness. "I have 150 people out there," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "My family, friends, colleagues. They all came here to witness my marriage. What am I supposed to tell them?" Julian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his words were so unexpected that Victoria thought she must have misheard. "Marry me instead." Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "What did you just say?" "Marry me," Julian repeated, his voice calm, but his eyes burning with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Right now. Today. Let's not waste this ceremony or humiliate you in front of everyone you care about." "That's insane," Victoria whispered, standing up so quickly that her veil nearly slipped. "Julian, we barely know each other." "This is not some business transaction, isn't it, though?" Julian took a step closer, his presence somehow both comforting and overwhelming. "You need a solution to an impossible situation. I can provide that solution. Consider it a practical arrangement between two adults who respect each other." "Respect each other?" Victoria's voice rose slightly. "Julian, you can't just decide to marry someone out of pity." "This isn't pity." His eyes locked with hers, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "I've watched you, Victoria. Over this past year, I've seen your talent, your kindness, your strength. Brandon was a fool to let you go. I won't make the same mistake." Victoria's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The logical part of her screamed that this was madness. But another part, the part that was already dreading the walk of shame down the aisle to announce the wedding, was canceled, whispered that perhaps Julian's offer wasn't as crazy as it seemed. "You're serious," she said, searching his face for any sign of jest. She found none. "Completely serious," Julian confirmed. "I'll provide you with security, support for your business, and a shield from the gossip that will inevitably follow if you simply cancel today. In return, I ask only that you give this arrangement 1 year. After that, if you wish to dissolve the marriage, I'll ensure you receive a settlement generous enough to open your own flagship boutique anywhere you choose." 1 year, Victoria repeated numbly. 1 year as husband and wife, at least in public. We'll maintain separate lives in private if that makes you more comfortable. Julian's voice softened slightly. "I know this isn't the love story you dreamed of, Victoria, but it could be a new beginning rather than a devastating ending." Outside, Victoria could hear the guests growing restless. The string quartet had started playing filler music for the 3rd time. Soon, someone would come looking for answers. She looked at Julian, really looked at him. His expression was earnest, his posture confident but not aggressive. There was something in his eyes that spoke of genuine concern, perhaps even something deeper that he wasn't ready to voice. "Why would you do this?" Victoria asked one more time. "The real reason, Julian." He held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because some opportunities only come once in a lifetime, and I refuse to let this one pass by." Before Victoria could respond, a gentle knock came at the door. "Victoria!" Rachel's voice called through. "Honey, people are starting to ask questions." "What should I tell them?" Decision time had arrived. Victoria looked down at her hand-sewn gown, the product of countless hours of passionate work. She thought about her business, her reputation, her pride. She thought about walking out there to face the pitying stares and whispered gossip that would follow her for months. Then she looked at Julian Thornfield, standing before her with an offer that was both absurd and strangely compelling. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word emerging before she could overthink it. "Yes, I'll marry you." Something transformed in Julian's expression, a flash of triumph mixed with what might have been relief. He extended his hand to her, and when Victoria placed her fingers in his palm, she felt an unexpected warmth spread through her. "You won't regret this," Julian said quietly. "I already do," Victoria replied, but there was no real heat in her words. "Let's go before I change my mind." As Julian opened the door and they stepped out together to face Rachel's shocked expression and the chapel full of waiting guests, Victoria realized her life had just taken a turn she never could have anticipated. In the span of 30 minutes, she had gone from abandoned bride to the wife of one of the city's most eligible millionaires. The only question now was whether this impulsive decision would prove to be the worst mistake of her life or something else. Entirely something that might actually save her. The chapel doors opened, and a hush fell over the gathered guests. Victoria felt Julian's hand at the small of her back, steady and reassuring as they walked toward the front where Rachel stood frozen in disbelief. The whispers started immediately, rippling through the pews like wind through wheat fields. "Is that Julian Thornfield? Where's Brandon? What's happening?" Victoria kept her eyes forward, her chin raised with a dignity she didn't quite feel. Julian leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Breathe. I'm right here with you." Rachel grabbed Victoria's arm the moment they were close enough. "Vic, what are you doing? This is crazy!" "I know," Victoria whispered back. "But it's done. Please just trust me." Her sister's eyes filled with confusion and concern, but she nodded slowly. Julian turned to address the minister, Reverend Thomas, who looked thoroughly bewildered by the sudden change in groom. "Reverend Thomas," Julian said calmly, his voice carrying the same authority he used in boardroom negotiations. "There's been a change of plans. Brandon Mitchell will not be attending today. However, Miss Hayes has agreed to marry me instead. I trust this won't be a problem?" The elderly minister's eyebrows shot up. "Well, This is highly unusual, Mr. Thornfield. The license will be handled immediately after the ceremony," Julian assured him smoothly. "I have my attorney on standby. For now, I ask that we proceed with the blessing and the vows. The legal documentation can follow within the hour." Reverend Thomas looked at Victoria, concern etched in his weathered face. "My dear, is this truly what you want?" Victoria met his kind eyes and found herself nodding. "Yes, Reverend. Please proceed." What followed was perhaps the strangest wedding ceremony in the chapel's 200-year history. Julian asked Rachel to serve as Victoria's witness while he gestured to his business associate, Thomas Chen, who had been attending as a guest, to stand as his. The guests sat in stunned silence as Reverend Thomas began the familiar words of the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." As the Reverend spoke, Victoria's mind drifted to the past year. She remembered the first time she had truly noticed Julian Thornfield. It had been at Brandon's gallery showing last autumn. While Brandon worked the room with his easy charm, Julian had stood before one of the photographs for nearly 20 minutes. Studying it with an intensity that fascinated her, she had approached him, curious about what held his attention so completely. The photograph was one of Brandon's earlier works, a black-and-white image of an abandoned train station at dawn. "What do you see?" she had asked. Julian had turned to her, and something in his expression had caught her off guard. "Possibility," he had said simply. "The beauty of things left behind, waiting to be discovered again." Now, standing beside him at the altar, Victoria wondered if he had been talking about more than just photography. "Do you, Julian Robert Thornfield, take Victoria Marie Hayes to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Thomas asked. "I do," Julian said, his voice clear and unwavering. When he looked at Victoria, there was something in his gray eyes that made her heart skip. A devotion that seemed far too genuine for a marriage of convenience. "And do you, Victoria Marie Hayes, take Julian Robert Thornfield to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Victoria hesitated for only a heartbeat. "I do." Julian produced a ring from his pocket, and Victoria's breath caught. It wasn't the ring Brandon had chosen, a simple gold band she had helped select months ago. This ring was extraordinary, a vintage piece featuring a cushion-cut sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds set in platinum. It was the kind of ring that spoke of careful selection, of knowing someone's taste intimately. "My grandmother's," Julian explained quietly as he slid it onto her finger. "She would have wanted you to have it." The weight of the ring felt significant, permanent in a way that frightened and thrilled her simultaneously. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Julian stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her face with unexpected gentleness. "May I?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Victoria nodded, unable to find words. When Julian's lips met hers, the kiss was nothing like she expected. It wasn't the perfunctory peck of a business arrangement. Instead, it was tender, questioning, as if he was trying to communicate something he couldn't put into words. Despite everything, despite the insanity of the situation, Victoria found herself responding, her hands coming to rest against his chest where she could feel his heart beating as rapidly as her own. The kiss lasted only seconds, but when they pulled apart, the chapel erupted in confused applause. Julian kept his arm around Victoria's waist as they turned to face the guests, presenting a united front against the sea of shocked and curious faces. The reception that followed at the nearby country club became an exercise in creative storytelling. Julian handled the questions with the smooth expertise of someone used to controlling narratives. Brandon had experienced a family emergency and left suddenly, he explained. Rather than cancel and waste the beautiful celebration Victoria had planned, Julian had stepped in. They had been growing close over the past months, he said, and this seemed like fate's way of bringing them together. The story was ridiculous, but Julian sold it with such conviction that people began to accept it, or at least pretend to. Victoria played her part, smiling and accepting congratulations while her mind reeled with the surreal nature of it all. "You're quite the actress," Julian murmured during their first dance, his hand warm against the small of her back as he guided her across the floor. "I'm a terrible liar," Victoria admitted, acutely aware of how close they were, how his cologne smelled like cedar and something uniquely him. "Then perhaps you're not lying," Julian suggested, his eyes searching hers. "Perhaps some part of you recognizes that this decision, impulsive as it was, might be exactly what you needed." "Needed?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I needed to marry a near stranger?" "You needed someone who sees your worth," Julian said softly. "Someone who won't run when things get real. Someone who understands that love isn't just passion and pretty words. It's commitment and showing up even when it's hard." The words struck something deep inside Victoria. "Is that what this is? You showing up?" "Among other things," Julian replied, spinning her gracefully. "I've been showing up for you for months, Victoria. You just never noticed." Before she could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by guests wanting to offer congratulations. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of cake cutting, toasts from confused relatives, and endless questions Victoria deflected with practiced vagueness. As evening fell and guests began to depart, reality started to sink in. She was married. To Julian Thornfield, a man she barely knew who had somehow convinced her to make the most impulsive decision of her life. "We should talk," Julian said as his driver brought the car around, "about the practicalities of this arrangement." They rode in silence to Julian's home, and Victoria's eyes widened when they pulled through iron gates onto a sprawling estate just outside the city. The house was a beautiful blend of modern and classic architecture, all clean lines and warm stone, surrounded by manicured gardens that glowed in the landscape lighting. "This is where you live?" Victoria asked, suddenly feeling very small and overwhelmed. "This is where we live now," Julian corrected gently. "I had the guest house prepared for you. Completely separate entrance, full kitchen, your own space. You'll have complete privacy." Inside the main house, Julian led her to a study lined with books and art. He poured them each a glass of wine and gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. "I want to be clear about the terms," Julian began, his businessman demeanor sliding into place. "This marriage will last 1 year. During that time, we'll present ourselves as a happily married couple at public events, probably 3 or 4 per month. You'll continue running your design business with my full financial backing to expand if you choose. In exchange, I ask only that you maintain the appearance of this union." "And after the year?" Victoria asked, sipping her wine. "After the year, if you wish to end the marriage, I'll ensure you receive a settlement of $5 million and full ownership of any business ventures we've established. You'll be free to walk away with no obligations." Victoria nearly choked on her wine. $5 million? "Is that not enough?" Julian asked seriously. "I can negotiate higher." "Julian, that's absurd. Why would you pay me $5 million for pretending to be your wife for a year?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting firelight. "Because your happiness is worth that to me. Because I want you to have the freedom to build whatever life you dream of, whether that includes me or not." The sincerity in his voice unsettled Victoria. This wasn't how business arrangements were supposed to work. There was emotion behind his words, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "I need to understand something," Victoria said, setting down her wine glass. "Why me? You could have any woman you wanted. Why go through this elaborate plan to marry me?" Julian stood and walked to the window, his shoulders tense. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Do you remember the gallery opening last November? The one where Brandon was showcasing his urban exploration series? Of course. That's where I first really talked to you. I watched you that night, Julian said, still facing the window. You moved through the room with such grace, genuinely interested in every person you spoke with. You asked thoughtful questions about the art. You made people feel seen and valued. And when you laughed, the whole room seemed brighter. He turned to face her. And Victoria saw vulnerability in his expression that shocked her. Then I watched Brandon ignore you for most of the evening, too caught up in his own success to notice how you stood alone in corners, waiting for him to remember you were there. I watched you pretend it didn't hurt, and I thought, what kind of fool takes something precious for granted? Victoria's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. She remembered that night, remembered feeling invisible while Brandon basked in praise and attention. I started paying attention after that, Julian continued. I'd visit your studio under the pretense of discussing projects with Brandon. I'd attend events I knew you'd be at. I learned that you volunteer at the community center teaching sewing to underprivileged teens, that you always order mint tea instead of coffee, that you have a habit of tucking your hair behind your left ear when you're thinking deeply about something. He moved closer, kneeling before her chair so they were eye to eye. I learned that you deserve someone who pays attention, Victoria. Someone who shows up. And when I heard Brandon plan to abandon you today, I knew I couldn't let you face that humiliation. But more than that, I knew I couldn't let you slip away without taking this chance. Tears pricked Victoria's eyes. This chance for what? To prove to you that love doesn't have to hurt, Julian said simply. That someone can choose you every single day without hesitation. Victoria reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she touched his face. Julian, I don't know what to say. Say you'll give this arrangement a fair chance, he replied, covering her hand with his. Say you'll let me show you what it's like to be truly cherished. In that moment, sitting in the firelight with this unexpected man kneeling before her, Victoria realized that perhaps being abandoned at the altar wasn't the ending she had feared. Perhaps it was the beginning of something she never knew she needed. Okay, she whispered. 1 year? Let's see where this takes us. The smile that transformed Julian's face was worth every moment of uncertainty. 3 months had passed since that impossible wedding day, and Victoria found herself standing in the garden of Julian's estate, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Her morning tea grew cold in her hands as she reflected on how much had changed, and how much remained uncertain. The guest house had become her sanctuary, a beautifully appointed space where she could retreat when the weight of her decision felt too heavy. But increasingly, Victoria found herself spending more time in the main house, drawn there by Julian's quiet presence and the unexpected comfort she found in his company. True to his word, Julian had given her space and freedom. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give, yet somehow, that restraint made her want to close the distance between them even more. You're up early, Julian's voice came from behind her, and Victoria turned to find him approaching with 2 fresh cups of tea. He had learned her preferences, remembered the little details that made her feel seen. Couldn't sleep? Victoria admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully. I kept thinking about the charity gala tonight. Tonight would be their biggest public appearance yet, a fundraiser for the Arts Foundation where Julian sat on the board. Victoria had designed a custom gown for the occasion, a flowing creation in deep emerald that had taken weeks to perfect. Nervous? Julian asked, settling onto the garden bench beside her. He maintained a respectful distance, as he always did, but Victoria found herself wishing he would sit closer. A little, she confessed. Your world is so different from mine, Julian. These people, they can tell I don't really belong. Julian's expression hardened slightly. You belong anywhere you choose to be, Victoria. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. His fierce defense of her had become familiar over these months. Julian protected her reputation with the same intensity he brought to his business dealings, shutting down gossip with a single cold look, redirecting conversations when people asked too many questions about their whirlwind romance. But it was the private moments that had begun to change everything. The evenings when they'd share dinner and talk for hours about art and dreams and the things that mattered. The Sunday mornings when Julian would bring her coffee in the studio and simply sit quietly while she worked, his presence somehow making the creative process easier. The accidental touches that lingered a moment too long, charged with an awareness neither of them acknowledged aloud. "I should get ready," Victoria said, standing reluctantly. "Thank you for the tea." "Victoria," Julian called as she turned to leave. When she looked back, something intense flickered in his gray eyes. "You look beautiful in the morning light." Heat flooded her cheeks, and she hurried away before he could see how his words affected her. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, a temporary solution to an impossible problem. She wasn't supposed to feel this flutter in her stomach when he smiled. She wasn't supposed to lie awake at night wondering what it would be like if Julian kissed her again. Really kissed her, the way a husband kisses his wife. That evening, as Victoria descended the main staircase in her emerald gown, she found Julian waiting at the bottom. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence. But it was the expression on his face when he saw her that stole her breath. "My God," he breathed, his usual composure slipping. "Victoria, you're absolutely stunning." "The dress came out well," she said, smoothing the fabric nervously. "I'm not talking about the dress," Julian replied, offering his arm. "Though your talent is evident in every stitch, I'm talking about the woman wearing it." The gala was held at the city's most prestigious museum, the marble halls filled with the wealth and influence of the art world. Victoria recognized several prominent collectors, gallery owners, and artists as they made their entrance. Heads turned as Julian guided her through the crowd, his hand warm and possessive at her waist. "Julian, darling," a cultured voice called out. A striking woman in her 50s approached, her designer gown dripping with diamonds. "I heard the most interesting rumor about your sudden marriage." "Patricia," Julian acknowledged coolly. "May I introduce my wife, Victoria Thornfield?" Victoria caught the way he emphasized the word wife, claiming her publicly in a way that sent unexpected warmth through her chest. She extended her hand graciously. "It's lovely to meet you." Patricia's sharp eyes assessed Victoria thoroughly. "A wedding dress designer, I understand?" "How quaint. Tell me, how exactly did you manage to snare the city's most eligible bachelor?" "Patricia!" Julian's voice held a warning edge, but Victoria squeezed his arm gently, signaling she could handle this. "I didn't snare anyone, Mrs. Harrison. Julian chose me just as I chose him. Sometimes the best relationships happen when you least expect them." Something like approval flickered across Patricia's face before she moved on to her next target. Julian looked down at Victoria with undisguised admiration. "Well handled." "I can fight my own battles," Victoria said softly. "But thank you for wanting to protect me." The evening progressed smoothly, with Victoria finding herself genuinely enjoying the conversations about art and culture. Julian never left her side, his presence a constant source of support and pride. She noticed how he introduced her, always highlighting her accomplishments, making sure people understood she was more than just his wife. During dinner, seated at a table with several foundation board members, Victoria felt Julian's hand find hers under the table. The gesture was hidden from view, private and intimate. His thumb traced small circles on her palm, sending electricity up her arm. "Are you all right?" he murmured, leaning close enough that his breath tickled her ear. "Yes," Victoria whispered back. More than all right. Their eyes met, and in that moment something shifted between them. The pretense they had been maintaining, the careful distance, suddenly felt unbearable. Victoria saw in Julian's expression the same longing she felt, the same question they had both been avoiding. What if this arrangement had become something real? The moment was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected guest. Brandon Mitchell stood at the entrance to the ballroom, looking disheveled and desperate in a poorly fitted suit. Victoria's hand tightened involuntarily on Julian's as her former fiancé spotted them and began making his way across the room. "Stay calm," Julian said quietly, his entire body tensing like a predator preparing to defend its territory. "I won't let him hurt you." Brandon reached their table, ignoring the curious stares from surrounding guests. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair unkempt. "Victoria, I need to talk to you." "There's nothing to discuss." "Brandon," Victoria said, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite her racing heart. "Please," Brandon begged, his voice breaking. "I made a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. I want you back." Julian stood slowly, his height and presence making Brandon take an involuntary step backward. "My wife said there's nothing to discuss." "I suggest you leave before security escorts you out." "Wife!" Brandon spat the word. "You married him out of spite, Victoria. To get back at me. But we both know you don't love him." The words hung in the air, and Victoria felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. This was the moment of truth. The opportunity to admit that yes, this marriage had started as a convenience, a way to save face. Instead, she stood and moved to Julian's side, taking his hand in hers. When she looked up at him, she saw vulnerability in his eyes, a question and a hope that made her heart ache. "You're wrong, Brandon," Victoria said clearly, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "I don't love Julian out of spite or convenience or any other reason except one. I love him because he showed up when you ran. Because he sees me, truly sees me, in a way you never did. Because every single day he chooses me. And I choose him." Julian's sharp intake of breath was audible. His hand squeezed hers almost painfully tight as he stared down at her, disbelief and joy warring on his face. "You don't mean that," Brandon protested weakly. "She does," Julian said, his voice rough with emotion. He turned to face Victoria fully, ignoring Brandon and everyone else in the room. "Do you mean it, Victoria? Because if you're just saying it to send him away, I understand. But if there's any chance you actually feel what I've been feeling these past months, I need to know." Victoria's heart thundered in her chest. This was it. The moment that would define everything that came after. She thought about the past 3 months, about Julian's patience and kindness, his quiet strength and unexpected vulnerability. She thought about how he made her laugh, how he supported her dreams, how being with him felt like coming home. "I mean it," she whispered, then louder. "I mean it, Julian. I love you." The ballroom erupted in whispers and gasps, but Victoria barely heard them. Julian pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was nothing like their chaste wedding ceremony. This kiss was fire and promise, 3 months of restrained desire finally unleashed. His hands tangled in her carefully styled hair while hers clutched at his jacket, pulling him closer, desperate to eliminate any space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "I've loved you since that first gallery opening," he confessed. "When you asked me what I saw in that photograph, I saw possibility, Victoria. I saw you." Tears streamed down her face, happy tears that she didn't bother to hide. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you deserved the choice," Julian said simply. "I couldn't tell you how I felt and expect you to believe it was genuine, not when our marriage started as a transaction. You needed time to discover your own feelings without the pressure of mine." Security had quietly escorted Brandon out during their kiss, and the gala slowly resumed around them. But Victoria and Julian remained in their own world, oblivious to everything else. "Take me home," Victoria said softly. "Our home." The drive back to the estate passed in charged silence, their hands intertwined on the seat between them. When they arrived, Julian helped her from the car with the same careful courtesy he always showed. But there was heat in his eyes now, permission finally granted to show what he had been feeling all along. Inside the main house, Victoria kicked off her heels and turned to face her husband. "No more guest house," she said firmly. "No more separate spaces. Are you sure?" Julian asked, though he was already pulling her close again. "We can take this slowly, Victoria. I don't want to rush you. I've wasted enough time believing love had to hurt," Victoria replied, reaching up to cup his face. "Show me what it's like to be truly cherished." Starting right now, Julian needed no further invitation. He swept her into his arms and carried her up the grand staircase to the master suite she had never entered. The room was elegant and masculine, but Victoria barely noticed the details because Julian was kissing her again, his hands gentle and reverent as they explored. "I love you," he murmured against her lips, her neck, her collarbone. "I will spend every day proving it to you." "I love you too," Victoria breathed, helping him out of his jacket. "Thank you for showing up, Julian. Thank you for choosing me." That night marked the true beginning of their marriage. Not the business arrangement signed in a lawyer's office, but the genuine union of two hearts that had found each other in the most unexpected way. As dawn broke over the estate, Victoria lay wrapped in Julian's arms, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "What are you thinking?" Julian asked sleepily, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'm thinking that maybe getting abandoned at the altar was the best thing that ever happened to me," Victoria admitted. "It brought me to you." Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Brandon did us both a favor, though I'll never thank him for it. He gave me the opportunity to prove that real love shows up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. So what happens now?" Victoria asked. "We were supposed to have 9 more months of this arrangement." "Now we live," Julian said simply. "We build a real marriage, a real life together. We support each other's dreams. We show up for each other every single day. And when people ask how we made it work, we tell them the truth. That sometimes the best love stories start with the wrong beginning, but find their way to the right ending." 6 months later, Victoria stood in that same garden where she had shared morning tea with Julian. But this time she wasn't alone with her uncertainty. Her hand rested on the small swell of her stomach, a secret she would share with her husband that evening over dinner. The wedding dress business had expanded beyond her wildest dreams with Julian's support, but she had recently hired a talented assistant to help manage the workload, because Victoria had discovered that success meant nothing if you didn't have someone to share it with, someone who showed up and chose you every single day. Julian emerged from the house, still wearing his work clothes, but his face lit up the moment he saw her. That look, the one that said she was the most important thing in his world, never failed to make her heart skip. "Hello, my love," he said, pulling her into his arms for a lingering kiss. "How was your day?" "Perfect," Victoria replied honestly, "especially now that you're home." As the sun set over their estate, Victoria reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She had been abandoned at the altar by a man who didn't deserve her, only to be claimed by a man who saw her true worth. The bride who had cried at the altar had become a wife who smiled every single day, and the millionaire who had stunned everyone with his unexpected proposal had simply done what he always did. He had shown up for the woman he loved and chosen her over and over again until she finally understood that she deserved nothing less. Their story had started with tears and ended with joy. And as Victoria looked into Julian's eyes that evening and told him about the baby they had created together, she knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters were still to come. Because real love doesn't always start with a fairy tale beginning. Sometimes it starts with heartbreak and impossibility. But when two people choose each other, show up for each other, and build something genuine together, that's when the real magic happens. That's when a business arrangement becomes a love story for the ages. The end.